Washington sent a signal that changed the temperature in Brussels before anyone fully understood its consequences. It did not come in the form of a treaty withdrawal. It did not arrive as a troop redeployment order. It arrived as a strategic declaration, delivered with calculated clarity and designed to reshape assumptions that had underpinned Western security architecture for decades. JD Vance stood at a policy forum in Washington and articulated what many in the American electorate had been debating quietly for years. The United States, he argued, could no longer sustain automatic, unconditional defense guarantees for wealthy European nations, while domestic security concerns remained unresolved and strategic competition in the Indo-Pacific intensified. The statement was not theatrical, it was deliberate. Within minutes, European diplomatic channels began buzzing. Brussels analysts parsed every word. Did this signal an imminent withdrawal from NATO commitments? Was Article 5 under threat? Or was this the beginning of a negotiated recalibration? The transatlantic alliance rests not merely on hardware, but on predictability. For 75 years, the assumption of American reinforcement under NATO's collective defense clause formed the backbone of European security. American troops stationed across Germany, Poland, Italy, and the Baltic states symbolized permanence. Vance's declaration did not revoke those deployments. It did not formally renounce NATO. But it did something arguably more destabilizing. It questioned inevitability, and inevitability is the oxygen of deterrence. European leaders reacted publicly with composure. The European Commission reaffirmed commitment to partnership. NATO officials emphasized treaty continuity. Yet behind closed doors, emergency briefings unfolded. Because strategic planning depends on certainty, even rhetorical uncertainty forces recalculation. Germany's defense ministry convened analysts to evaluate exposure. France revisited its long-standing advocacy for European strategic autonomy. Eastern European states, particularly those geographically closer to Russia, expressed deeper concern. For them, American commitment is not abstract. It is existential. Markets responded cautiously. Defense stocks rose slightly in Europe, reflecting expectations of increased continental spending. Currency fluctuations were modest. Investors anticipated negotiation rather than rupture. But the political shock was undeniable. The United States has historically pressured Europe to meet NATO's 2% GDP defense spending target. Multiple administrations expressed frustration with burden-sharing imbalance. Yet those criticisms were usually paired with explicit reassurance of enduring commitment. Vance's framing differed. He suggested that Europe must stand on its own militarily if the United States is to prioritize emerging challenges in the Pacific. This was not isolationism. It was strategic reprioritization, and reprioritization implies finite resources. Inside Brussels, scenario modeling accelerated. Scenario 1 envisioned rhetorical pressure leading to accelerated European defense investment, while U.S. commitments remained structurally intact. Scenario 2 imagined gradual troop reduction over years, shifting operational balance toward European command. Scenario 3 contemplated deeper structural transformation, where NATO evolves into a more equalized transatlantic framework with reduced American dominance. Each scenario carried consequences. For decades, Europe's post-war peace architecture relied on American power as external stabilizer. The integration project advanced under that security umbrella. If the umbrella weakens, integration dynamics shift. France's strategic thinkers quietly revived debates about independent nuclear deterrence credibility. Germany faced political constraints balancing pacifist tradition with security reality. Poland accelerated calls for deeper regional defense coordination. Meanwhile, Washington framed the message domestically as accountability. American taxpayers, according to Vance's argument, should not indefinitely subsidize defense for nations with comparable economic strength. The political undercurrent was clear. American voters increasingly prioritized domestic resilience over overseas commitments perceived as disproportionate. The phrase that echoed most strongly across European capitals was automatic defense guarantees. Automatic suggests reflexive. Removing automatic introduces discretion. Discretion introduces ambiguity. Ambiguity invites testing. Russia observed carefully. From Moscow's perspective, rhetorical strain inside NATO presents opportunity for probing unity through cyber operations energy leverage, or regional pressure. China observed as well. If American focus shifts toward Asia, reduced European reliance could free U.S. assets for Indo-Pacific deployment. But if Europe destabilizes, Washington may remain entangled. The paradox defined the moment. A stronger, self-reliant Europe could ultimately reinforce Western stability. Yet the transition from dependency to autonomy carries vulnerability. Transitions are when adversaries test boundaries. European Parliament debates intensified. Calls for consolidated EU defense procurement increased. Proposals for shared missile defense architecture gained traction. Budget reallocations were discussed urgently. Public opinion across Europe split. Some welcomed the wake-up call. Others feared abandonment. The strategic truth lay somewhere in between. No formal treaty had changed. No troops were withdrawn overnight. But the psychological architecture shifted. And in geopolitics, psychology shapes posture long before policy shifts become visible. The coming months would determine whether this was negotiating leverage or foundational recalibration. But one thing was certain. The assumption of permanence had been disrupted. And once permanence becomes conditional, the system adapts. The initial shockwave did not produce chaos. It produced calculation. Brussels understood that the most dangerous crises are not those announced with dramatic rupture, but those introduced through gradual reframing. JD Vance's statement reframed the central assumption of post-war Europe, that American military backing was not subject to political fluctuation. Once that premise became debatable, the strategic map of the continent required revision. Inside NATO headquarters, internal communications intensified. Senior military planners requested clarification from Washington regarding force posture timelines, funding projections, and command structures. The responses were careful. No treaty withdrawal, no immediate reduction. Yet the language emphasized review, assessment, and rebalancing. Those words signaled flexibility rather than permanence. Germany found itself at the center of the recalibration. As Europe's largest economy and a major host of American forces, Berlin faced the prospect of assuming greater responsibility. Defense modernization programs accelerated on paper. Political debate intensified domestically. Decades of strategic culture built around limited military assertiveness collided with the possibility of expanded continental leadership. France viewed the moment differently. Paris had long advocated for European strategic autonomy, independent of American dominance. In some circles, Vance's declaration validated that long-standing argument. Yet autonomy requires capability. Capability requires funding, industrial coordination, and political consensus across 27 states. Those elements cannot be assembled overnight. Eastern European governments reacted with sharper urgency. For Poland and the Baltic states, the American guarantee is not a philosophical question, but a security anchor. Increased European spending was welcome, but credibility rests on rapid deployment capacity, intelligence integration, and interoperable command. Those capacities remain heavily intertwined with U.S. systems. Meanwhile, in Washington, the domestic political calculus hardened. Vance's argument resonated with a growing segment of voters skeptical of open-ended overseas commitments. The Indo-Pacific competition with China dominated strategic discourse. Defense planners openly acknowledged resource constraints. Carrier groups, missile defense batteries, and intelligence assets cannot be in two theaters simultaneously without strain. The European Commission convened emergency coordination meetings with member state defense ministers. The immediate objective was reassurance. Public messaging emphasized unity. Behind the scenes, procurement acceleration became priority. Joint European defense initiatives previously stalled by bureaucratic fragmentation were revived with new urgency. Markets remained watchful but stable. Investors interpreted the situation as political recalibration rather than imminent rupture. Defense sector stocks across Europe experienced upward momentum, reflecting expectation of increased continental spending. Currency markets showed limited volatility, suggesting confidence in macro stability. Yet beneath market calm, strategic planning underwent revision. Contingency exercises modeled scenarios where American reinforcement timelines were delayed. Logistics chains were examined for redundancy gaps. Cyber defense protocols were reassessed under conditions of partial transatlantic coordination. Russia's reaction was measured but attentive. Official statements framed Western debate as evidence of internal contradiction. Strategic analysts in Moscow evaluated potential windows for testing alliance resolve through hybrid tactics. However, Russia also recognized that overt provocation could accelerate European militarization, producing unintended consequences. China analyzed from a different angle. A reduced American footprint in Europe could free U.S. assets for Indo-Pacific focus. Yet instability in Europe might demand continued American engagement. Beijing's strategic assessment remained cautious, observing rather than acting. Inside European capitals, the debate expanded beyond defense budgets. It touched identity. For decades, European integration evolved under the shelter of American power. Economic integration flourished partly because existential security concerns were externalized. If that external stabilizer becomes conditional, the integration project acquires new weight. Public discourse intensified. Commentators questioned whether Europe had grown strategically complacent. Others argued that burden-sharing debates were overdue. Vance's critics in Europe framed his remarks as reckless destabilization. His supporters framed them as necessary realism. The phrase automatic guarantee continued to dominate analysis. Removing automatic does not remove commitment, but it introduces deliberation. Deliberation introduces politics. Politics introduces uncertainty. Uncertainty forces investment. Within weeks, proposals for expanded European rapid reaction forces resurfaced. Joint procurement mechanisms for air defense systems gained momentum. Intelligence sharing platforms sought deeper intra-European integration to reduce reliance on American systems. However, structural limitations remained. Europe's defense industry is fragmented across national lines. Procurement duplication reduces efficiency. Political rivalry slows integration. Overcoming these constraints requires sustained political capital. The European Central Bank monitored financial implications carefully. Defense spending expansion affects fiscal balances. Countries already burdened by debt face difficult trade-offs. Yet security urgency can override fiscal caution. In Washington, clarification speeches followed Vance's initial statement. The message evolved into structured burden-sharing reform rather than abrupt disengagement. Emphasis shifted toward renegotiating expectations rather than terminating alliances. Yet the psychological shift persisted. Deterrence depends on adversaries believing reinforcement is certain. When certainty becomes negotiable, perception recalibrates. NATO leadership intensified joint exercises to project unity. Visible military drills along eastern flanks aimed to counter speculation of weakening resolve. These exercises were both operational and symbolic. European political leaders engaged in shuttle diplomacy with Washington. Reassurance was sought. Commitments were reaffirmed in careful language. Yet the vocabulary of partnership replaced the vocabulary of permanence. The transition from dependency to partnership is subtle but profound. Months passed without dramatic rupture. No American bases closed. No treaty amendments were announced. Yet defense spending commitments across Europe rose measurably. Procurement contracts multiplied. Military training coordination intensified. Vance's statement had not dismantled NATO. It had accelerated European militarization. The paradox emerged clearly. Pressure designed to reduce American burden catalyzed European investment, potentially strengthening long-term alliance durability. However, transitions remain delicate. If European spending increases fail to translate into operational capability quickly, vulnerability windows may emerge. If American political cycles produce further rhetorical fluctuation, uncertainty could deepen. The geopolitical landscape shifted incrementally rather than explosively. European autonomy debates matured from theoretical aspiration to practical necessity. National parliaments approved budget expansions once considered politically impossible. Defense-industrial cooperation advanced cautiously. Across the Atlantic, American policymakers debated the appropriate balance between reassurance and reform. Too much reassurance would undercut burden-sharing incentives. Too little reassurance would destabilize deterrence. The strategic equilibrium settled into a new pattern. Conditional commitment replaced assumed permanence. Shared responsibility replaced asymmetrical reliance. The episode would later be studied as a pivotal moment in transatlantic recalibration, not because it ended America's defense of Europe, but because it ended the assumption that such defense was politically insulated from domestic debate. Assumptions are the foundation of alliances. When assumptions evolve, alliances adapt. Europe did not collapse into panic. It entered a period of accelerated self-examination. The United States did not withdraw. It renegotiated expectations. And in that renegotiation, the architecture of Western security shifted subtly but irreversibly toward greater European responsibility. The story was not one of abandonment, it was one of transformation. Transformation rarely announces itself loudly. It unfolds through speeches, debates, budgets, and drills. And once underway, it reshapes the strategic future in ways that become visible only years later.